You grew up hearing that New Zealand is a small country at the bottom of the world, 5 million people, far from everything. An economy built on dairy and tourism. You know Fonterra is massive. You know that when the price of milk powder in China drops, the Kiwi dollar drops with it. That's just how things are. But here's what nobody told you. Before dairy, before tourism, before Fonterra existed, before the word diversification became the most repeated word in every government economic strategy document, New Zealand was one of the richest countries on the planet. Per capita, richer than the United States, richer than most of Europe. And the entire thing, every dollar of it, was built on the back of one animal, the sheep. More specifically, what the sheep wore: wool. And when the world stopped wanting New Zealand wool, the whole thing collapsed. Not slowly, not gently. It broke. Farmers lost everything. Towns emptied out. The government had to tear up the economic rule book and start again from scratch. The reforms of the 1980s, the shift to dairy, the obsession with property, the vulnerability to what China decides to buy tomorrow, all of it traces back to what happened when wool fell apart. That's not ancient history. That's the origin story of the economy you're living in right now, and almost nobody your age knows it. By the end of this video, you'll understand how wool made New Zealand rich, why it stopped working, and why the lessons from that collapse are still the most important thing to understand about the Kiwi economy today. Not as a history lesson, as a map of where we are right now. Everything in the wool story comes from two questions. The first is this: how did wool make New Zealand one of the wealthiest countries on Earth? And the second: what happened when the world stopped buying? Those two questions have simple answers, but the answers explain almost everything about how New Zealand's economy works today. The first question is about the boom. The second is about the bust. And the place where those two answers meet is the part most people never see. We're going to start with the world that existed before the boom, because that's the only way to understand why wool mattered so much in the first place. Picture New Zealand in the 1840s, a pair of islands at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, about as far from Europe as you can physically get on this planet. No significant mineral wealth, no oil, no gold rush that lasted. No large domestic market, because there were barely any people here. Britain had just formalized its relationship with the country through Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and settlers were arriving. But the fundamental economic question was brutally simple. What can we produce here that someone on the other side of the world would actually pay for? That's the question every small, isolated economy has to answer. And for New Zealand, the answer was staring at them from every hillside. Grass. New Zealand had enormous amounts of grass, rolling green hills with reliable rainfall, mild winters, and more pastoral land per person than almost anywhere else on Earth. The grass was useless on its own, but put a sheep on it, and the grass becomes wool. And wool, in the 1800s, was one of the most valuable commodities in the world. New Zealand was like a cafe that opened at the end of a road nobody drives down. Far from everything, no foot traffic, no passing trade. The only question was whether you could make something good enough that people would travel to come and get it. And wool was that thing. Before you can understand the boom or the bust, you need to understand the idea that makes both of them possible. And that idea is commodity dependence. Commodity dependence is what happens when the economy of an entire country relies on the price of one thing that the country doesn't control. New Zealand grew the wool. New Zealand sheared the sheep. New Zealand baled it, shipped it, sold it. But New Zealand did not set the price. The price was set by global demand, by how much wool the world wanted and how much other countries were producing, and whether someone in a factory in Bradford or a military supply office in Washington decided they needed more or less of it this year. This matters because when you depend on a single commodity, your wealth is not really yours. It's borrowed. It's contingent. It lasts exactly as long as the world keeps buying, and when the world stops buying, or finds something cheaper, or finds someone else who sells it for less, everything you built on top of that commodity starts to shake. Think of it like running a restaurant, where you serve one dish and you have one customer. While that customer comes in every night, life is brilliant. You hire more staff. You renovate the kitchen. You buy a nicer house. Everything is getting better every year. But your entire life depends on that one person walking through the door. And the day they stop coming, it doesn't matter how good your dish is. The restaurant is in trouble. That's commodity dependence. And New Zealand, for more than a century, was the restaurant. Wool was the dish. And for a very long time, the customer kept coming. So here's how the boom worked. From the 1860s through to the mid-20th century, wool was New Zealand's #1 export. Not one of the top exports. The export. The thing that paid for everything. Schools, hospitals, roads, railways, the early welfare state, the houses that became the quarter-acre Pavlova paradise, all of it funded, directly or indirectly, by selling wool to the world. And the customer, for most of that time, was one country, Britain. The relationship was almost absurdly simple. New Zealand produced wool and meat and butter. Britain bought it. Under a system called imperial preference, products from Commonwealth countries got favourable access to British markets. So New Zealand had a guaranteed buyer, at good prices, for essentially everything it could produce. This matters because it meant New Zealand didn't need to diversify. Why would you? You had the best grass in the world, the best wool, and a customer who bought everything you made at a good price. The incentive to develop manufacturing or technology or alternative industries was almost zero. The rational thing to do was exactly what New Zealand did. Grow more sheep, produce more wool, ship it to Britain, collect the check. And for decades, it worked beautifully. By the 1950s, New Zealand had one of the highest standards of living on the planet. Free healthcare, free education, full employment, generous pensions, a house and a section for almost everyone who wanted one. The Kiwi dream wasn't a dream, it was real. And it was paid for by 60 million sheep. Then came the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. And this is where the boom went from comfortable to extraordinary. The war created massive demand for wool because militaries needed it. Uniforms, blankets, insulation. The price of wool didn't just go up, it exploded. In the 1950 to 51 season, wool prices roughly tripled. New Zealand, a country of fewer than 2 million people, was suddenly flush with cash in a way that's hard to comprehend today. The Korean War wool boom was like winning the lottery, except the entire country won at the same time. Farmers bought new equipment, new land, new cars. The government had surplus revenue. The standard of living jumped. And here's the thing about a lottery win. Nobody plans for what happens when the money stops, because while you're winning, it feels like it's going to last forever. The key point is this. The boom wasn't just about money. It was about identity. New Zealand became a country that believed deeply that its prosperity was natural, that the grass would always grow, the sheep would always produce, and Britain would always buy. That belief shaped everything. It shaped the welfare state, the housing culture, the national psychology. And it made the bust, when it came, not just an economic crisis, but an identity crisis. Now here's the second question. What happened when the world stopped buying? The bust didn't arrive as a single event. It came as 3 blows, spread over about 20 years, and each one hit harder than the last. The first blow was synthetic fibers. Starting in the 1950s and accelerating through the 60s and 70s, the textile industry discovered that you could make fabric out of petrochemicals, nylon, polyester, acrylic. They were cheaper than wool. They were easier to produce. They didn't need sheep or grass or shearing gangs or shipping from the bottom of the Pacific. And they were good enough. Not better than wool, but good enough for most purposes at a fraction of the cost. This is the blow that people underestimate. It didn't kill wool overnight. It eroded it. Year by year, decade by decade, the share of global textile production that used wool shrank. New Zealand was still producing beautiful wool, but the world was slowly finding it didn't need as much. The second blow was the one that really hurt. In 1973, Britain joined the European Economic Community, what would later become the European Union. And the door that had been open for over a century quietly closed. Britain could no longer give preferential treatment to New Zealand products. The guaranteed customer, the one who had been walking through the restaurant door every single night for 100 years, stopped coming. The impact on New Zealand was devastating, and it's hard to overstate this. Imagine you've built your entire life around one client. Your house, your car, your kids' school, all funded by that one relationship. Then one morning, the client calls and says they've found a new supplier. Closer, cheaper, and they're contractually obligated to buy from them now. That's what happened to New Zealand in 1973. The UK didn't stop buying New Zealand products overnight. There were transition periods and quotas, but the direction was clear. The guaranteed market was gone. The third blow was self-inflicted, and it's the one that shows how badly commodity dependence distorts decision-making. The New Zealand Wool Board, trying to protect farmers from falling prices, set up a minimum price scheme. The idea was simple. If global prices dropped below a certain level, the Wool Board would buy the wool itself, stockpiling it until prices recovered. The problem was that prices didn't recover. They kept falling. And the Wool Board kept buying. The stockpile grew. And grew. And grew. Millions of bales of wool sitting in warehouses, waiting for a recovery that wasn't coming. The stockpile was like trying to hold back the tide by filling buckets. It worked for a while. The buckets looked full. Everything looked under control. But the tide kept rising, the buckets overflowed, and eventually the whole thing collapsed under its own weight. The Wool Board's stockpile had to be sold off at massive losses. The minimum price scheme was abandoned. Farmers who had been shielded from reality were suddenly exposed to the full force of global markets. And then, in 1984, the fourth reform arrived. The new Labour government, under Finance Minister Roger Douglas, removed agricultural subsidies almost entirely. Rogernomics, as it became known, was the most dramatic economic transformation in New Zealand's history. Farmers who had been supported by guaranteed prices and government subsidies for decades were suddenly on their own. Some adapted, many didn't. Farms were sold, rural communities hollowed out. The sheep population, which had peaked at around 70 million in 1982, began a decline that hasn't stopped. Today, there are fewer than 26 million sheep in New Zealand, less than half of what there once was. Here's the part most people never see. The wool boom and the wool bust feel like they're two different stories. One about getting rich, one about losing it. A rise and a fall, a before and an after. But they're not two stories. They're one story. And the thing that connects them is the structure underneath. The wool boom worked because New Zealand found something the world wanted, produced it brilliantly, and had a guaranteed buyer. The wool bust happened because that buyer left, the product got replaced, and the country had no backup plan. The same structure that made the boom possible made the bust inevitable. Dependence on one commodity, sold to one market, with no diversification. That's not two facts. That's one fact, seen from two different moments in time. And here's why this matters right now. Look at the New Zealand economy today. The country's biggest export earner is dairy. The biggest customer is China. The product is different. The customer is different. But the structure is the same. A small country at the bottom of the world, producing a commodity, selling it to a market it doesn't control, hoping the buyer keeps coming back. Every time the price of milk powder in China drops and the Kiwi dollar falls with it, the wool story is happening again. Not in the same way, not with the same severity. New Zealand has diversified more than it had in the wool era. There's tourism, there's tech, there's horticulture, there's wine. But the core vulnerability is still there, and it will be there until the economy is genuinely broad enough that no single commodity and no single customer can shake the whole thing. Once you see this, you can't unsee it. The wool boom built New Zealand. The wool bust shaped it. And the lesson is still being learned. Here's where most people get the story wrong. The first mistake is thinking that the dependence on dairy is something new. It's not. It's the same structure that existed with wool, wearing different clothes, wool to dairy, Britain to China, sheep to cows. The product changed. The vulnerability didn't. And recognizing that pattern is the first step to understanding why economists keep talking about diversification. The second mistake is thinking that Rogernomics, the removal of subsidies in 1984, was random or cruel. It wasn't. It was the unavoidable consequence of decades of commodity dependence and market protection that had become unsustainable. The subsidies were masking reality. When they were removed, the reality was painful, but it had been painful for years. The subsidies were just hiding it. The third mistake is thinking this is all ancient history that doesn't affect you. Every time you check the exchange rate before buying something online and see the Kiwi dollar sitting at 60-something cents against the US dollar, that's the structure. Every time the RBNZ makes a decision partly based on commodity export prices, that's the structure. Every time someone says New Zealand needs to move up the value chain and stop just exporting raw materials, they're describing the lesson the wool bust taught, and that the country is still learning. Let me show you exactly how this knowledge is useful right now. When you hear that the Kiwi dollar dropped because dairy prices fell at the global dairy trade auction, you now understand why. It's not random. It's the same mechanism that made the dollar move when wool prices changed 50 years ago. The currency reflects what the world thinks your exports are worth. When someone tells you to diversify your Kiwi saver or your investments, they're giving you the exact same advice that New Zealand, the country, needed to hear in 1960. Don't put everything in one thing. Don't depend on one market. Don't assume the customer keeps coming. What's true for a country is true for your portfolio. When you read about the government investing in technology, film, software, education exports, you're seeing the direct legacy of the wool bust. New Zealand learned, the hard way, that you cannot build a permanent economy on a single commodity. Every diversification strategy the country pursues today is an echo of what happened when wool collapsed. And when someone asks you why New Zealand is so expensive, part of the answer is the same isolation that defined the wool economy. A small country, far from everywhere, with limited scale. The shipping costs, the lack of competition, the small domestic market, these are the same structural features that shaped the wool era. They haven't changed. Geography is permanent. Here's what you now know. The three most practically useful ideas from the wool story are these. First, New Zealand's prosperity has always depended on selling something to the world, and that makes the country permanently vulnerable to what the world decides it wants. That was true with wool. It's true with dairy. It'll be true with whatever comes next. Second, every boom feels permanent while you're in it, and the only protection against the bust is diversification, not just for the country, but for your own finances. Third, the wool boom didn't just end. It transformed into the economy you live in now. Dairy, tourism, the property obsession, Rogernomics, the modern Kiwi saver system, the push to diversify. All of it is the wool story, still playing out. Next time someone tells you that New Zealand is a small country that depends on dairy and tourism, you'll know that's not an accident. It's the scar of a boom that built everything and a bust that taught the hardest lesson in economics. Never depend on one thing. The wool built the dream. The bust made sure we'd never forget what happens when the dream has only one leg to stand on. This is general education, not personalized financial advice. If you need advice for your situation, talk to a licensed financial advisor.